Of course, we are doing this live, so please feel free to jump in and send us any questions you have or make any comments as we go along. We're very pleased to answer them as we go tonight. Now, let me introduce our special guest for today. Our guest is Karen Toohey, who is the ACT Discrimination Commissioner and also the Health Services Commissioner. Karen's a very experienced advocate when it comes to human rights issues, equality issues, and general protection of some of the most vulnerable in our community. Not only does she currently have a senior and important role at the ACT Human Rights Commission, but she has previously been the Deputy Commissioner in the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, which I think will lead us in well to a discussion around the proposed COVID app. And she's also been the Acting Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer within the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. So a very experienced advocate. Thanks very much for joining us, Karen, and welcome to this broadcast.
Thanks, Jane. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Terrific. Well, it's obviously, the public health emergency has obviously seen a significant number of restrictions put in place for our community in order to try and protect us from the virus. I think many in the community recognise that these are necessary restrictions, but obviously raise lots of questions as well. From your point of view at the Human Rights Commission, what's your general observation on the measures and their consistency with, for example, the ACT being a human rights jurisdiction?
Yeah, look, the Commission, as you know, Shane, has been really pleased to be involved in a lot of those processes. We have had input into the legislation as it's come through. Obviously, it's very quick turnaround on some of these issues. I think one opportunity that will arise is, as we know, the Assembly has announced an ongoing COVID-19 inquiry, and I think the Commission will be contributing to that to flag up some of the issues that we think need to be monitored as these processes go along and as the emergency plays out. I think it's been clear that the ACT, compared to some of the other jurisdictions, has been very mindful of people's rights in how they've rolled out some of those emergency measures. And I think that's clear in things, you know, for example, the difference between New South Wales around restricting to essential movements. We've got different restrictions in place. I think we've also been really good in acknowledging that the police and some of those other organisations have a big role, and the police being very cognisant of the potential negative impact if they are overzealous in their approach to things. I think there are some areas where we, you know, particularly because of the breadth of the measures that are being considered and that are having to be put in place, where there are some areas where, for example, some of the health measures that have been put in place are not subject to the human rights scrutiny process. And I guess we would query whether it might be appropriate for some of those scrutiny processes to be put in place, even though technically those measures are not legislative. So I think there's an ongoing opportunity to ensure that that human rights lens is put over all the measures that are affecting our community. And as we've seen from some of the questions that have come through, you know, people are really cognisant of where those rights are balanced around, you know, the right to, you know, protect people's lives and safety versus, you know, how restrictive some of the measures are that are being imposed. But again, the Commission's really pleased to be involved in those processes.
Yeah, and that question of balance, of course, is one of the central premises of the Human Rights Act, is that the need for proportionality of measures and to balance up what are often competing interests. I certainly agree with your comments around the role that ACT policing has played. I think if we compare to some other jurisdictions, I've been grateful and, you know, very pleased at the way ACT policing has taken a more educative approach. We've still had no one be fined in the ACT. It probably reflects on the fact that the community's played their part as well, but I think it's been a much better approach than we've seen in some of the other jurisdictions. Yeah,
and I think, as you know, one of the reasons for that, and the reason why we need police to behave in that way, is if we want community compliance with these measures, they need to have confidence that they're going to be implemented properly. So I think that's been a really important conversation between government and the AFP, but also with the community about ensuring that they've got confidence that these measures are rolled out properly. And as we've seen in some of the other jurisdictions, if you're getting fined for having a driving lesson, that actually reduces people's confidence that these measures, A, are necessary, but B, that they're being implemented appropriately.
Now, we've had some great questions sent in, Karen, so we might get into some of the ones that have already been sent. But as I say, if anybody is watching live and would like to send a question, I'm also monitoring the Facebook page here, and we'd be very pleased to take your live questions as they come through as well. The first question we've got, and it's probably the big topic of the week, is about the proposed app, the tracing app, if you like. I don't know what its formal name is yet, but there's been a lot of questions about that, Karen. The main one, or I guess this sums it up really, is what is your position on the federal government's proposed tracking app? Are there any concerns from the Commission that the contact tracing app may be used to limit people's movements? For example, if you don't have the app, you won't be allowed to attend a health service or a concert or all sorts of public events. What are your thoughts on the app generally?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we're working on information at the moment that's in the public domain, so we don't have a lot of information about it. I did have a conversation with my federal colleagues last week, with the Privacy Commissioner and with the Human Rights Commissioner, who have both been involved in looking at the app and making sure that it is human rights compliant. I think the obvious sort of issues are that we're not quite sure yet how an app that collects data under a federal system is going to be transmitted to a state-based service for tracing purposes. So we've got some questions about that. I think the other concern that we have and has been broadly expressed is we know that the information, doesn't do geolocating and those sorts of things. We know the purpose for which it's been collected, and if you download the app, you've essentially consented to that process, so that's okay. The concern lots of people have is secondary use, and we don't have any particular information about that. We've got lots of reassurance, but we've had that in other spaces before. I think our view would be that there may be worth some consideration of putting specific legislative measures in place around the app and its use of that information in the ACT. We think the ACT could probably lead the way in that space. Part of the reason for that is as everybody knows, our privacy legislation, both federally and at a state level, is still catching up with technology. And I think that's been obvious, in a number of issues that have played out. And so we're not confident that the legislation, and I think we need to have a look at that the legislation as it currently stands provides sufficient protections for an app that wasn't contemplated when the legislation was built, and B, in a scenario that wasn't contemplated. Legislation, as you know, is built for day-to-day operation. It's not usually built around the concept of a pandemic and emergency situation. So I think we would be suggesting that there might be some value in having a look at whether there is, it would be appropriate to have a legislative response in the ACT to provide community with certainty, because again, the certainty increases the uptake. And I think what we're all looking for is to ensure that there's maximum uptake. We all want to protect our community members. We know the tracing has been absolutely a critical factor of the success in the ACT. And I think if we can support our community with some confidence in that space by saying, we want you to do this. We know it's a voluntary process, but we're going to make sure that we have properly considered the implications of it. And if necessary, put some legislation in place to give you that confidence.
Yeah, I saw a statement from Human Rights Watch, the global NGO, who said that any surveillance measures must have a legal basis, be narrowly tailored to meet a legitimate public health goal, and contain safeguards against abuse. I thought that was a fairly succinct summary of the sort of protections we want to see in place for this kind of app. I think a lot of people understand why an app like this would be really valuable from a public health point of view. But I think you particularly spoke of sort of those secondary uses. I think that's where a lot of people's concerns lie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are all cognizant that, and I think there's been some public commentary around it, that, geolocation and all those sorts of things, people are very, very concerned about that sort of information being available to government. People are concerned, the nature of the information that's being collected may well identify people, if police, for example, had access to that information, may lead to more fines, may lead to other types of interactions with people or other types of enforcement mechanisms. And I think while it sounds like government, and certainly, as I said, for my federal colleagues, they're very cognizant that in order to get the uptake, they have to be able to reassure community about how the app's going to be used. The fact is that's what we know today, but in 6 months we don't know how it's going to be used. And I think, again, it would be a good move for the ACT to be on the front foot in that space, again, to protect our community. And really, that's what we're all hoping will come out of this process.
Yeah, and I certainly know through the National Cabinet process, and I've spoken with the Chief Minister about this, he's very clearly advocating for some of those protections to be put in place. And I think the impression we have so far is that things are a lot better in terms of the ideas behind this than they perhaps were a week ago, that the development of the app is certainly heading in the right direction. But I think there's still some work to do to make sure that when it does come out, that it has the sort of things that we'd expect. Others have observed, for example, it should have open source software so that others can look at it, and there's that degree of transparency that then can give the community confidence about some of these privacy and information protection issues we've been talking about.
And I think one of the concerns that's certainly been raised with us, and I think you referenced it, is we may want the information used in a particular way. Health may want the information used in a particular way. But if I've then got, as you say, a venue operator saying, if you haven't got the app, you can't come in, unless we make it really explicit that other people can't expect you to use the information in those ways or to have those sorts of engagements with the app. I think that, it's those unintended consequences that we need to think carefully about and make sure that we're not on the back foot trying to deal with it down the track. And we've seen that, certainly part of the discussion we had was, we saw with the e-health record, for example, which no one wants to talk about, but because there was that lack of confidence in the process, and because it was then, okay, we haven't got enough opt-ins, we're going to make it mandatory, and there wasn't sufficient confidence in that product because the work hadn't been done to explain all those other factors. And I get this as a much more targeted piece of work, but those same concerns are obviously, still prevalent in the community. And I think, we've certainly seen already, for example, some retirement village providers and other sorts of providers taking it into their own hands to start tracing visitors coming into facilities and that sort of thing. And so I think there's that real potential for there to be unintended consequences of everybody knowing that this app might be available and you might have it on your phone. And so, again, I think there's some, it's an opportunity for us. Appreciate it means moving quickly, but on the other hand, everyone's being very nimble at the moment. But I think it might be an opportunity for the ACT just to have a think about whether we do actually need to put those protections in place now so we get the uptake we want when the app rolls out.
I think it's going to be essential to have those protections in place and be really transparent with the community, or people are simply not going to join up and use the service, and it will, it therefore won't deliver the outcome that we're seeking. I think that's going to be the scenario. For those who've just joined, welcome to the broadcast. My guest today is Karen Toohey, the ACT Discrimination Commissioner. And if you've got a question for Karen, please feel free to Facebook Live it. Tap the question in. We're monitoring the questions, and I'll be pleased to either answer them myself if I can, or put them to Karen, depending on the nature of your question. Let me change tack for a minute, Karen. One of the questions that's come in from Fiona is, has the Commissioner seen an increase in complaints about COVID-19 related racism, particularly for health workers? And what should people do if they have been discriminated against? I think we have seen some unfortunate examples, certainly early on, particularly directed at the Chinese community, but what's your experience been over at the Commission?
Yeah, we have seen an increase in complaints and inquiries coming in around COVID-related issues generally, and they're covering a wide range of areas. We haven't, fortunately, had complaints coming in from health workers specifically. One of the examples that we've had and we responded to quite early was that notion of people in retail settings, for example, being vilified essentially because of their race or some other factor. We went back and spoke to the retailers about the signs that you've got up saying, our staff are here to help, don't abuse our staff or you'll be removed, are great. But we think they should also say, all other customers, we have a responsibility to our customer base as well. And so I think there's some steps that can be proactively taken in those settings and we've been working with some of the retail chains and those sorts of places to put those measures in place. As I said, fortunately, we haven't seen it coming out of the health setting, but what we have seen are people, like, we're getting complaints from older people about social distancing not being applied appropriately, young people coming up to them deliberately to push into their space, and that not being well managed in some settings. So we're seeing a range of complaints across a range of areas. We have seen some race complaints, funnily enough, well, not funny, in fact, in accommodation. So in things like apartment blocks, people being abused in those apartment blocks. And so we've done some work with some of the estate managers and the real estate agents around the ACT about what they need to do, again, about making those common places safe. If people experience discrimination or vilification, if they see it happening, if they're concerned that something might be discrimination or vilification but they're not sure, the Commission is open for business. Please call us, please email us, please go to our website. We not only deal with complaints, we provide a lot of information to the community about what their options are. And we're also just keen to understand what people's experiences are, because our responses are not just about the individual matter. As you know, Shane, we do a lot of systemic work and we're in that educative space. And so we've been making a lot of phone calls, emails, doing a lot of that work to ensure that our service providers in particular are making sure that they're compliant with their obligations to provide safe spaces to people.
I think it's a really good point to make, and perhaps not many people in Canberra have experience with the Human Rights Commission, but one of the key roles they play is that educative role and often intervening to avoid things becoming more serious and making, whether it's a business or a government department or a range of others, aware of their responsibilities and helping to just try and head off discrimination before it becomes worse. And I think that's perhaps not understood by a broad cross-section of the community. So it's great to be able to have this conversation this evening. The next question we've got has come from Tim, and he said, how do the rights of protest and the freedom of movement and association work in a public health emergency? Karen, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, a small question.
Indeed.
Look, I think, again, an emergency is a legitimate reason. An emergency of this nature is a legitimate reason for limiting people's rights. And we've seen this in a range of settings. The human rights framework, obviously, it is a means of ensuring that those rights that we as individual citizens have are not unnecessarily or disproportionately limited in a circumstance where governments can use it as an opportunity to go further than they need to, have a disproportionate impact on their citizens' rights. And, you know, it becomes a grab bag of things that the community is very concerned about, and government says, no, we're doing this for your good. Those issues around freedom, you know, restricting people's movement, obviously there's been really good take up by community, and I think, again, it's been very reassuring for people to know that those measures are working. They're not disproportionate in terms of the crisis that we're trying to respond to, and we're seeing that they are proving to be effective. I think we are all, comforted by the fact that our Chief Health Officer, who has done an amazing job, stands up there day after day after day reminding us why we are complying with these restrictions. I think, as we know, these frameworks provide a mechanism by which we make sure that those, that balance is right. What we also know is that we need safeguards. So we do have appeal rights built into these processes. They're temporary. They have sunset clauses. They're not ongoing and indefinite. And I think the ACT community can be reassured that we see all of those mechanisms coming into play in the legislation that's coming through. I think, as I said before, I think one of the things that we think might assist ongoing, both is the Legislative Assembly inquiry, and we think it would be really good for that inquiry to perhaps have a monitoring role with respect to the to some of the data, so who is getting fined, who is getting moved on, those sorts of things. But we also think, again, that there might be a role for additional scrutiny for measures that are being taken that are not necessarily subject currently to the standard human rights scrutiny processes. And I think, again, that provides a reassurance to community that they're not being asked to give up rights unnecessarily or for extended periods of time unnecessarily, and that there is a scrutiny process being applied that ensures that balance, that balance is properly applied.
Yes, I think they're really good points. And Denby sent in an example as one of the pre-questions talking about in terms of protests, people were fined for driving down the street in Melbourne with refugee action posters on their cars. I think that was, again, the difference we've probably seen in the ACT versus the difference we've seen in some of the other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and again, I think what we saw coming out of that was that it actually undermines community confidence in the measures that are being taken. As you know, the ACT does have has not gone as far in terms of limiting people's ability to go out and move around, providing we comply with the social distancing requirements. And that's really the main feature that the ACT has been focused on. Obviously, there are some restrictions around visits and how many people in your house and those sorts of things, which are all primarily, again, around the social distancing requirements. So I think it's really important. And again, I know, Shane, that government particularly is engaging with those enforcement agencies around needing to ensure that while they ensure compliance, they don't actually undermine community confidence in the measures that are being taken. And, there are some very strong community refugee advocates in the ACT, and they were very, very upset about this. So I got some emails about this issue. It's essential to them that they go and make their views known. And so I think the ACT has found a really good balance, and we've been monitoring all those things, and we've asked the community to give us feedback if they think that those provisions are not being adhered to appropriately. We've had some stories so far, and we think maybe there was some overzealous, if we use that word, police intentions in some specific geographic areas. We've raised those concerns and they've been dealt with really effectively. So I think providing community continues to communicate with us, with you, with government, if they do see those concerns, that's really important, again, so that we ensure that community are confident that the restrictions in place are appropriate and that they will be, rolled back as appropriate and, for the safety of our community.
Now, I've sorted out my technology, Karen. We've actually had some questions coming in live, and I was just looking at the wrong part of the website. So let me duck back to some questions that came up a little earlier. And Matt has asked the question, back to talking about the app, which we were discussing earlier. Would it currently be legal for public services, shops, etc., to say no app, no service, or no admission? Would that actually be legal in the ACT, to your understanding?
I don't really see how it would be, because the app itself is as it's being sold to us at the moment, it's a voluntary, it's a voluntary take-up. So there's no requirement under law for the app to be in play. It's a tracing tool. It's not a tool that tells people, it doesn't help with the distancing requirements, in that it doesn't go bing if you're too close to somebody. So which you would think would be the only reason that someone in a venue might say you have to have the app. But the fact is it's a voluntary process at the moment. So I don't see how that would be lawful for particular providers or service providers to require people to have the app in order to access their services.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Not that I'm providing legal advice, Shane.
Of course not, and neither am I, but that would be my understanding as well. So thank you, that's a good answer. Josh sent in a question earlier saying, if there is currently no law or direction restricting non-essential travel in the ACT, how is it consistent with Canberra's legislatively protected freedom of movement and privacy for police to stop nearly 400 motorists to ask the purpose of their travel as part of an Easter blitz targeting unnecessary travel, and implied that fines will soon follow for unnecessary travel. So I think Josh is referring to the fact there that police over Easter did position themselves at a number of the exit roads to the ACT, and they did pull a lot of motorists over and ask them. I might start on that because I have seen a briefing from the Chief Police Officer about that. I understand ACT policing did not hand out any fines, but certainly I think they were seeking to make it very clear that the New South Wales Police were taking quite a different approach. And part of their purpose was to obviously try and minimise people's travel, but I think also be very clear that if you did drive to New South Wales with your ACT number plate on, you're a fair prospect of copping a fine from the New South Wales Police. So certainly the way the Chief Police Officer put it to me was that they were seeking to both have that impact on limiting travel, but also to some extent give Canberrans a hand in making sure they didn't get fined if they went to New South Wales.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. I think there's a difference between being very clear, given very clear direction not to travel, and being fined for doing that. So, I think they're quite different things, because a stop power leading to a fine or to some sort of enforcement mechanism is a little bit different to, as you say, essentially a precautionary model. Certainly, I think we all had the experience. I certainly had the experience of friends in Sydney who thought they were essentially travelling, who found out they weren't essentially travelling when they were stopped. And so I think because the ACT does have slightly different rules, it's in some ways it's a supportive response to ensure that people understand that the rules across the border are quite different, and the New South Wales community is subject to quite different restrictions to those in the ACT.
Lisa's asked, what would you say to workers who may be strongly encouraged, i.e. forced, by their employers to still attend their workplaces despite there being able to work from home? Now, I've had a few questions about this. I've had some people have actually asked me, and they've said, well, what can I do if I think I can make my job work from home, or I've talked to my team and we can set ourselves up, but my boss is not letting us work from home. Karen, do you want to give a first thought on that?
Yeah, look, as you know, our laws provide for, essentially allow people to request flexible work arrangements. I'm not going to comment on Fair Work because I'm not the expert on Fair Work obligations. I can say that I've, on numerous occasions over the last few weeks, referred people to the Legal Aid, New South Wales Legal Aid website. They've got some very comprehensive advice for workers on what to do in those sorts of circumstances and what their rights and obligations are. I know in the ACT, the matters that we have dealt with, we've been in contact with the employer around the notions of risk and that people do have a right to work flexibly. And unless there is some absolute inherent requirement for people to be in the workplace, we would say obviously they've got the right to request flexible work arrangements, which is what they're doing. And the employer would have to demonstrate why those arrangements weren't suitable and why they couldn't perform the inherent requirements of the job.
Okay. And the other observation I would make is that, of course, WorkSafe in the ACT is the agency charged with ensuring safety in the workplace. And I think, in addition to the comments that Karen's made, you could always get in touch with WorkSafe ACT, and if you want to just get their advice in the first instance, that's part of what their remit is. So that's another option for workers here in the ACT. We've had a couple of...
I might just say as well, one of the things that, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is there's a lot of employers who think the job can't be done from home. And they've been thinking that for a long time for their female employees who have, need flexible arrangements to work from home because of childcare or caring responsibilities and all those sorts of things. And I think the thing that we're all finding is that it's not a soft option. And so,
indeed.
Like, it's not a soft option. But the technology is amazing, and I'm sure if the Coles employees and the Bunnings employees could work from home, they might be opting for that because I'm sure they feel, that they're in a high risk zone. But certainly, if people are having those experiences with their employers, as you say, they can ring WorkSafe, they can ring us, they can ring Legal Aid to get some advice about what their options are and how to have that conversation. And I think that's the other thing maybe that people don't get about our service, is it's not just about complaints. We will provide people with information about how do you have that conversation in a constructive way, so that it's not just a sort of yes no option, but how do you frame it for your employer as a benefit for them as well.
No, that's a really good point. Thanks, Karen. Got a few more questions come in. Yaelin has sent us a couple of questions. Yaelin, great to hear from you. Thanks for being in touch. She asked about what the Commission is doing about discrimination against the Chinese community and Asian communities. And I think we covered that a little bit earlier, Karen, but she then followed up by saying, could the information we talked about earlier be put on the COVID ACT website, because that is available in 107 languages. It's got a translating capability there. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we'll check that. For people who are not aware of that website, covid19.act.gov.au is sort of the single point of information during the pandemic for all sorts of questions about whether it's the support packages, the economic support packages the government's provided, health information, how to reach certain government agencies, what the various restrictions are. That's a great central source of information. We'll pop that in the chat box below if you haven't got the address, but it's covid19.act.gov.au. Jonathan Troy has come through with a question. Jonathan says, has the ACT passed any moratorium on evictions, as the Victorian government has? Well, Jonathan, I can let you know that the Attorney-General actually signed the instrument yesterday, so it's come into effect today, and there is now a moratorium on evictions. There's also a requirement to not increase rent during this period for people impacted by COVID, in terms of losing their job or losing some of their working hours. So that, if you're really interested in the detail, the instrument is available on the website, but the short answer is yes. There's quite a lot of protections in place for tenants now. There's also an arrangement where the ACT government will help fund a reduction in rents. A landlord can apply, and the ACT government will match any reduction up to $100 a week. So the tenant could see a $200 a week reduction in their rent. The landlord will wear $100 of that, but the ACT government will also cover $100 of that. So I think there's some really practical options where, lots of people are going through difficult times, and in a deal like that, everyone can play their part. The government, the landlord, the tenant gets some support. So that sort of information about the rental things is also available on that COVID website. I've also had a question here from Steve, who's asked about, and it's a little bit off this exact discrimination topic, so bear with us for a second, Karen, but he's asked, are we ever going to do anything about adolescent mental health in Canberra? We don't have an adolescent mental health unit currently, and this puts us at a disadvantage to the rest of the country. Well, actually, Karen might have a view on this as the Health Services Commissioner. What I can tell you, Steve, is that the government has committed to building an adolescent mental health unit in the ACT. That work is funded. The planning is currently underway. The design work is being done, and it is due to be finished in 2021.
Yeah.
I think is right. Karen, you might be able to, I just haven't looked at that for a while, but do you want to add any thoughts on this, on adolescent mental health, with your view as Health Services Commissioner?
Yeah, look, I think particularly in the current environment, people are really concerned about getting access to those services. As I understand it, it is 2021. We have had some input into the model of care, which we're really happy again that we've been involved in, as have my colleagues in the Children's Commissioner team. I think it's a really important question, Shane, and I know you're really committed to ensuring that there is not just adequate, but excellent access for children and young people in the ACT to mental health services. It's so critical, and I think I'd also just say that the Office of the Chief Psychiatrist has been doing, a lot of good work in that space with the Office of Mental Health, and that there is a lot of planning going on in that space. And again, that planning is, I think, providing reassurance to community at the moment that there's a lot of services available to people, and that they should be accessing those. I know we've had some calls from people because their children are at home for longer periods of time. They're not, they're isolated in different ways. Not all kids have access to technology, that they do need access to those services. And so people are struggling, I think, in some ways to find points of access. Again, there's really good information on the ACT Health website about how to access those services, and I'd encourage people to do so.
Sure, and I think when it comes to adolescent mental health, we have been thinking about this a lot, and it's not just a matter of having an adolescent inpatient unit. As the Minister for Mental Health, I get a lot of advice from people who say that an inpatient unit is not always the best place for some people. And in fact, often being hospital, for some people is really not the best thing, and trying to support them in a home environment where they feel more comfortable can be more recuperative or therapeutic than actually being put into a unit in a hospital. And certainly we have already funded a range of outreach programs where staff will come to a young person's home and actually seek to support them there on a regular basis. And that can actually also provide an opportunity to interact with the family as well, because often giving the family support and lessons and indications of how to support the young person can be really beneficial, or might even identify some issues within the family that are part of finding a better solution for the young person. So Steve, the bottom line is we are building an adolescent mental health unit, but there is a lot of other support in the meantime. And if you've got a particular case that you're concerned about, please feel free to follow up with my office, and we can provide some further advice to you on that matter. Karen, we've got a general question that's come through from Jara about how practically can the Discrimination Commissioner help me if I feel like I've been fired because of my race or religion. Is it worth coming forward, or is it just going to end up in some mediation session?
I know I feel slightly disappointed about the idea of, is it only going to end up in a mediation session? Complaints about being dismissed or treated unfairly because of race or religion or age or disability in employment are matters that we deal with all the time. People use our process because it's quick, it's accessible, it's informal, so they've got good control of the process. If people feel this has happened to them, if they give us a ring, we have a very quick turnaround on these sorts of matters. If someone's recently been dismissed, mediation can often lead to the person being reinstated, or at least things like references and those sorts of things, so that their next step into the workforce is supported. We find that employers and employees use the process frequently because they know it's accessible, it's confidential, it's quick. If we can't resolve the matter, then people do have the option of taking it on to the tribunal. And so it's not just that it ends up in mediation, it can go on for determination. But equally, conciliation, mediation processes exist across all the employment jurisdictions for that reason, that it's a fast and informal way of giving the parties control of the dispute, providing expertise to help negotiate an outcome. And we encourage people, again, to contact us if they're in that situation. There are lots of people who are not covered by Fair Work and those sort of industrial protections, and we deal with a lot of those sorts of matters. And I would be, again, encouraging people to see the Commission as an option in terms of assisting them to have those concerns dealt with, or at least being a source of information for what their options are.
Sure. No, I think that's, for me, one of the real strengths of the Commission is that whilst there are some very formal powers that the Commission has, there's a lot of ability to informally work on situations. And I think that can be very valuable in seeking to find a way through what are often very difficult and very emotional matters for people that are involved. For those that are watching, we've probably got just a few more minutes. So if you've got a burning question for Karen, type it in fast. We've got time to cover just a couple more. Karen, one of the other questions we've had is, how do we ensure that some of the restrictions, this has come from Rebecca, some of the restrictions don't lead us to essentially criminalisation of poverty? And how do we ensure there isn't a disproportionate impact on people who are in poverty and don't have the same access to resources or a house with a backyard, or in fact a home at all, in the case of some of our rough sleepers in Canberra?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. I think we're all concerned that people without means and without the internet and without a permanent home and without, particularly in the current environment, without economic security, are going to be exposed in ways, that they wouldn't usually if they weren't so visible. I know we're concerned, and we've certainly been in discussions again with ACT Police about how they go about policing these matters. We've been involved in discussions with the Health Protection Service and with Access Canberra in the same way. We are concerned that just by virtue of visibility, that those more vulnerable groups will end up on the pointy end of these processes. I think, again, there's been a really good reception to those discussions in all those organisations. But I think particularly sometimes in Canberra, we forget that there are lots of people who are in those vulnerable communities. They're not necessarily as visible to us because sometimes they're in pockets or they're in areas that are not central. And so I think we're very cognizant of ensuring that whatever the processes are put in place, it's not only that it doesn't happen, it's that throughout this process and at the end of the emergency that we've had data, we've had visibility and transparency. And again, we would be encouraging, the Assembly inquiry to be very cognizant of what data is being recorded, who's getting access to that information, how is it being monitored. I think we've also seen recently laws around, things like abuse of frontline health workers and those sorts of things. And so we need to be cognizant of where those laws are going to interact with this current emergency. We do have very strong discrimination law in the ACT. So in terms of protecting people on the grounds of accommodation status, that includes homelessness, race, immigration status. We have a range of discrimination grounds that are more advanced, I would suggest, than some of the other jurisdictions. And we really encourage people to think about issues or to think about concerns that they have that are happening to them, but also that we see in our community. So it's okay to be an active bystander, to either talk to the person maybe about contacting us or contact us on their behalf. There are people in the community that we go out and see where we know where they are to check that they're okay. We hear stories that people are being discriminated against because they're homeless or because of their employment status or some other reason. And if we're not confident that they can get to us, we can always go to them. And so, again, I think people should be confident that the ACT government has, worked hard to ensure that those protections are in place, and that that people can exercise their rights easily. And so we are very cognizant that some people see a Human Rights Commission as this, sort of body speaking in long terms and, about ivory tower sort of considerations and universal declarations. Actually, a lot of our work is about, getting on the buses, getting into health services, helping people who are homeless get access to, early morning centres and those sorts of things, making sure that tenants are safe, making sure that tenants aren't being evicted for the wrong reasons or those sorts of things. There's a whole range of issues that the Commission can deal with. And I think, again, Shane, you would be aware from the restructure a couple of years ago, the diversity of services that the Commission provides means that we've got really good visibility that, for example, if someone is a victim of family violence, they might be accessing the victims of crime services, but they might also have a discrimination issue to do with their attendance at work or their kids' attendance at school. And so those issues are ones that we can assist them to deal with. So again, the Commission and the government, I think, has been very strategic in bringing those functions together, and we would encourage community to contact us, both if they've got a concern themselves, but also if they're concerned about a community member or a family member.
No, thanks, Karen. That's a really good outline of the role the Commission can play and some of the services that are available, not during this COVID pandemic period, but for a whole range of matters that just occur for people from time to time. We've got a couple of more questions come in that I'll just cover before we finish up. One's come from Uta, saying, I just saw that Hamburg is making face masks mandatory as of 27th of April. Is something similar discussed here in the ACT? Well, Uta, not at this stage. We've not had advice from the Chief Health Officer that is a step that we need to take here in the Territory. That's say it might not become advice in the future, but we are listening very closely to both the ACT Chief Health Officer, but also she is sitting in the National Health Protection Committee, who are thinking about the situation for the whole of Australia and sharing information with each other. And so we've not had that advice at this stage. If we get that advice, then that's something that the government will need to consider, but not at this stage. And Jonathan has come back again. Is there any risk that the police powers granted to deal with COVID-19 will become permanent? And Jonathan, this is saying Karen touched on briefly a little earlier. The ACT Assembly has put through some emergency legislation at our last sitting. It was done in a real hurry. It was done as carefully as possible, and the opposition were briefed before it came into the Assembly. All of that legislation has been designed, or has incorporated what's called the sunset clause. And that basically means after a certain period of time, the legislation automatically, I guess, disappears out of the statute book. It stops having effect. Those laws can be continued, but it has to be another vote of the Assembly. So essentially, they automatically come to an end unless the Assembly agrees to extend them for some reason. So there might be some things that prove to be useful or necessary going forward, and there'll be others that are only necessary for this period, and they will end. So hopefully that answers the question clearly for you. Karen, we've just got, one last question coming through before I wrap up. What measures are in place to protect AMC detainees during COVID-19? Now, again, Karen might want to comment on this. I'll start as the Corrections Minister. We've taken a lot of steps because I'm very concerned. If we end up with COVID-19 in the jail, some people have described it as being like a cruise ship, in the sense that you're a bit stuck once you're in there, and it is hard to contain a virus in that sort of closed environment. We've taken a number of measures. The first is that we banned all social visits, or stopped social visits, from way back on the 22nd of March. We moved quite early to try and ensure we did as much as possible to protect our detainees. Instead, we've put in place audio-visual visits. So we bought a whole lot of tablets, and detainees have been having visits with their families or friends or whoever they want to via various social media apps. And I've had pretty good feedback that that's going quite well. We've got a range of other measures in place. We have been increasing the amount of surveillance, health surveillance of people coming in. So if anyone's got any symptoms, they've been tested. So far, all the tests have come back negative. And then we've got a series of measures. If we do end up with an outbreak, of isolation of people, quarantining of people. And we've also, in the recent legislation that went through the Assembly, given more powers for the Commissioner of Corrections to release people for an extended period of time in order to, for example, reduce the population in the jail, or people who are particularly unwell could be released on licence to try and protect their health as much as possible. But Karen, you're one of the oversight agencies for the jail as well. Do you want to add any comments in this space?
I think, Shane, as you've said, there's been a lot of measures put in place, and as you know, we've been being kept up to date with those. I think we can also reassure people that detainees are still able to call us and email us, similarly with the official visitors and similarly with the Ombudsman. So where concerns are being raised, and some of those, certainly with us, have been some concerns about the level of communication about the measures being put in place. We've obviously been in contact with ACT Corrections about those concerns, and they've been addressed very quickly. So I think everybody is very conscious of the fact that it's a particularly vulnerable group of people. As you say, they have no choice about who they're associating with. Self-distancing is difficult in that environment. We all know that. But I think, again, not only are there a range of measures internally, certainly us and the Ombudsman and the Inspector for Correctional Services are taking active steps to ensure that we are getting good information, and that where we are getting feedback from detainees or visitors or other people involved in the corrections setting, that they've got concerns, that feedback is going back to corrections very quickly. As Health Services Commissioner, as you know, I have very regular contact with Justice Health, and they have been very reassuring, both in being proactive about the information they provide to us, but again, also, if people raise concerns with us about the responsiveness of treatment that they're getting, Justice Health, have been doing a great job in terms of that liaison between us and the detainee who's got a concern. But again, if people have got specific concerns because they have relationships with people in the AMC, or they've had concerns raised by someone who's been in the AMC, certainly they can bring that to our attention or bring it to the Ombudsman's attention, and we can ensure that it's actioned if it needs to be.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Karen. Well, we're going to wrap our session up there. Thanks, everybody, for participating tonight. I really appreciate both the thoughtful questions and comments that have come through. We will go back. I'll check once I get offline if we've missed any. We'll, of course, jump on and answer them online later. Hopefully, I've picked up everyone's questions as we've gone. I'd like to particularly thank Karen Toohey, who is the ACT's Discrimination Commissioner, for being our special guest tonight, for bringing her expertise to the table and answering some of your questions and sharing some of the insights that the Human Rights Commission is getting during this pandemic period, and also outlining the sort of services they can provide that apply obviously at the moment during these challenging times, but are available all year round in terms of trying to resolve issues of discrimination in our community and various service agency problems that you might have. The Human Rights Commission, of course, is independent and has that ability to step in without needing to have agreement from the government. And that's a really important part of who they are and what they do. So, Karen, thanks very much for tonight. And I'll just finish up by saying, of course, don't forget that ACT Government COVID website. There is so much information available there. It's covid19.act.gov.au. Of course, the Human Rights Commission also has a website, and if you search for ACT Human Rights Commission, you'll find their website. I know they've got a lot of great fact sheets, contact points, and all of those sort of things. So thanks for watching tonight. Thanks for participating, and we'll see you all next time.